Okay, so we're going to start where we left off by using the same scene that you started with. And, in my case, I kind of organized some objects. Hopefully you have a scene going already that you can begin with. And so this tutorial is going to cover how to render, right? How to take what we have been working on in Cinema4d and turn it into either a JPEG, a PNG, some type of image that we could post to Instagram, maybe upload for credit in class, those types of things that are important to do with the things that you create. And so there's, so far as rendering goes, what we've been doing is we've been hitting Command or Control R to render in the viewport, right? And this is a reasonably high quality render. Depending on the resolution of your screen, it can actually take longer than rendering it out to an image because it can be bigger than the image that you would have rendered it to. Like with these Retina displays on the MacBook Pros, they're right. The pixel density is really high, and so it's actually rendering a lot more pixels than if you did like say a 1920 by 1080 image, which is sort of like a frame of video, right? For high definition video, not the 4K or whatever, but just standard high def. But we don't want to just render it in the picture viewer. We want to be able to render this to a file. And so what I'm going to do is I might add a couple more things to this scene just to have a little bit more backdrop. Although honestly, for the tutorial, having this totally black background might be really useful just because it's going to speed up the process and I'm not going to have to wait forever for this thing to render. So maybe I'll just leave it as it is. Hopefully you've added other colors to objects, or you're experimenting with some different materials and material properties. I'm just going to keep it boring and and really vanilla, I guess, right? It's literally like kind of white and creamy, which is what we associate with the color with vanilla, even though vanilla beans are not that color at all. Okay, so after that, let's go ahead and talk about rendering. So we've got a few buttons up here that look like something out of a video or film production set. These are our rendering options. First, the one with the little play arrow on it is render to the picture viewer, right? And so it also tells you the shortcut is Shift-R. And when we render to the picture viewer, let's go ahead and do that. We just click on it. And right, we render this image to the picture viewer, and you'll see that this is significantly smaller than what I saw on my screen. And if you come down to the very bottom of this window that popped up, you'll see that it is currently at 100% scale, and the size is 1280 by 720. It's RGB, 8-bit, and this is how big this image is. And it also tells you how long it took you to render that image, which was 6 seconds in this case. If I go, I can go ahead and scale this up. I can click Fit to Screen, right? And so then it'll expand until it fits within the boundaries of whatever size this pane is, right? Because it's adjustable. And I'm going to go ahead and pull this to the center of it. And so then there's a few other options over here. With the picture viewer, like let's say I've rendered it here and I'm like, oh, I'd really like this. Maybe I need my camera to, I don't like this angle. I want to adjust my camera. And so what I can do is I can say, I can either close or minimize the picture viewer. I'm just going to close it so it's not in my way. And I don't have to go find it again. And then let's say, okay, I actually want to rotate. I want to change the view on my camera, right? I really want this part of the squid. I want the whole thing up a little bit higher, and maybe I want to be a little closer to this object because there's so much detail in there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to zoom in a bit, and that might be enough. Yeah, let's go ahead and do this, right? So now I have this pretty dynamic object, right up in the foreground. It may not be in the best possible spot. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can figure out what cup that is and scoot it over a little bit. Cup 4. This is cup 4. I just was not paying attention, right? So maybe I want this to be up here a little bit so that it's, really close to the camera. And then maybe one of these other cups, like cup 3, maybe this can go right and kind of be off in the background a bit, and I can send it way back in space if I want to. Okay. All right, so now I'm like, okay, maybe this is the shot that I want. So if I go ahead and click on Render to Picture Viewer again, what happens is that it keeps the old image, right? So I've got an image here, and then I've got the one that's currently rendering. And so maybe I like both of these images, or I like this image. So now what I can do is I can come in here, and I can click on one of these options, and I can go up to either this Save Image As option, or I can go to File, Save Image As, right? Either one of those will work. And so this is one way to do this. We're going to look at a couple ways that we can set this up. So I'm going to click on Save Image As, and it has all of these options. By default, it saves it as a TIFF image, and TIFF is essentially, it's one of the highest quality image formats you can get, right? You really don't want to be saving your original artwork as a JPEG or as a PNG file, because those have compression in them, and if you save it in a compressed format right off the bat, you're going to start losing information immediately. And so if you want something that, say, you could then print later at a really high quality, you want to make sure that you save it either as a TIFF, or if you use Photoshop a lot, save it as a PSD, a Photoshop document, right? Those are the two of the best options out there. There's also the ability to save it as something called an OpenEXR, which is a format that's open source, and it's used across the video industry, and for a lot of animation and stuff, that's the format they use, and you actually render each frame to an image, rather than saving, if it was an animated thing, rather than using one of these options. So I'm going to leave it set to TIFF, because it doesn't really matter. One thing about TIFF, a lot of, like, if you try to upload that to Instagram, I don't think that TIFFs work with Instagram. You'd have to convert it to a JPEG or PNG or something else, and I don't think Instagram does that conversion for you. But I honestly haven't tried that, so I have no idea if I'm telling you the truth or I'm just lying to your faces. Okay, so that's the only thing I really need to set there. There's this option for changing the bit depth. We're going to leave it set to 8 bits per channel right now. We're just going to hit OK. Right, and then it'll ask you where you want to save it. And in my case, I'm going to save it where I have all these other project files. So I'm just going to go ahead, save. Right, so I've saved this version, and if I wanted to save this one, I would just go and do the exact same thing, right? I can go here, I can say, okay, it's a still image, TIFF, great, okay. And then, maybe I add like -01 or 02 or something to this, so I know that they are different images. Okay, and so I've saved that. So then I should be able to go, if I'm on the Mac, I'm going to go to what they call the Finder. You could go to the File Explorer. And I just want to make sure that these did indeed save and nothing crazy is going on. Oh, wrong folder. There we go. And so let's see here. Where's this? 4.1. There we go. And that's the video. Where's the images? Here it is. All right, so I've got this TIFF. Yes, it's saved. Okay. All right, so let's look at some of the settings we can adjust with our for our render. So I'm going to close the picture viewer, and I'm going to click on the one that has a gear on it. Right. So when it just means settings, right? We've all known that for a long time. It's basically every app ever has that as how you get to your settings. So the first one, by the way, any one of these things when it's highlighted in orange means that's what we're seeing in this panel here. So if I click on save, right now it's changed there. If I click on multipass, which we're not going to do right now, or anti-aliasing or options, etc., etc., etc. So the output allows me to set the resolution and whether I want to do this in a certain number of pixels or whether I want to do this in inches, centimeters, whatever, right? So if you're doing print media and like you're making something that you want to print in, say, on 11 by 14 paper or 16 by 20 paper, right? You can come down here and you can say, okay, I'm going to make this, I want this to be 16 by 20, right? Or I guess maybe 20 by 16 instead. And notice what's happening in the background. And we'll talk about that in a second. Right, okay, so this is 20 inches by 16 inches. And so what it's doing, right, this is landscape, right, that's 16, and it's 20 across. And so you'll see that there's these gray bars on either side, and before those gray bars were top and bottom. And what that means is anything that's within the full brightness is going to be in that final rendered scene. Anything that's hanging off the edge here is going to get cut off. So that's just something to be aware of as you're framing your objects, right? Because this viewport isn't quite the same proportions as a 16 by 20 image. And usually if you're printing, you want your pixel resolution to be pretty high, usually like 300 pixels per inch, which if you rendered out a 16 by 20 image at 300 pixels per inch, it's going to take a really long time to do that. For our purposes, in class, we're going to be looking at these on digital devices, and we're going to be, using them in that way. We're not going to be printing these. However, you can always say, oh man, I'm really proud of this project. I want to print this out. And then you could basically go in, change these output settings to, print quality settings, and then, go, I don't know, drink 3 pots of coffee and come back and have your image ready, right? Because it will take a while, especially if there's transparency and other things on there, and some of the other render settings that we're going to talk about in later tutorials. But so let's go ahead and change this back to pixels, because for your projects, the pixel dimensions I want are full HD. So I want the width to be 1920 pixels and the height to be 1080 pixels. And that's just it frames nicely with projectors, with, computer monitors, everything else. They're all set in that like letterbox style, right? Where it's, wider than it is tall. And so with this film aspect ratio of 1.778. Okay, and we'll leave it at 72 pixels per inch as well. So we're going to set it here. And then the other thing that we can do is if we click on the save option here, we've got the ability to go in here and actually set where we want this to save and what we want that file name to be. And so you could, and this is on a per project basis. So this isn't a setting for every time you come into Cinema4d. This is the settings for this project, right? So, and you can actually create multiple render settings. You'll see that this is currently my render settings is just the default place it saves all these settings. You can create several different settings, and then you can access those through any project. But we're not going to worry about saving this. The only thing here is that you can also set the default format. So anytime you go to render an image, you don't have to choose, like say if you want to do PSD files, right? You just set that here. And if you want the bit depth to be, 16 bits per channel, which might be a good idea, then you can do this. There's some other things here, alpha channel and 8-bit dithering and all of that. We're going to talk about those much later in the semester. Alpha channel essentially allows you to render out something with a transparent background. So anything that, right, in this image that's totally black would not, and isn't an object, right? Even though there's going to be some black on these objects. But if it isn't an object, and if it isn't within those bounds of the geometry, then it's transparent. So then you could composite this into some other image later. So, okay, right, so we're going to leave those. We're not going to worry about multipass right now. That's a more advanced setting. If we click on anti-aliasing, this is only available in one form, right? So The renderer right now is the standard renderer. There's actually multiple renderers, right? We're not going to worry about Pro Render right now. The two that we typically use are standard and physical. If you have I don't know if it's free for educational use by students, but if you have a Windows machine with, I believe it's an NVIDIA graphics card, and a very specific subset of all NVIDIA graphics cards, you can download this software called Redshift that does rendering on the GPU, and it's Cinema4d software as well. They just bought that company recently, but it's a really high quality renderer, and it's fast. So that would be amazing, but it's not something we're going to go into in the class because I don't even have a computer that can do that because I have a MacBook Pro with an AMD chipset in it for my GPU. So I can't use it. I can't show you how to use it. And so that's something that's pretty limited right now. But if you have the opportunity to get it and download it and you're interested in doing that, go for it. So with the standard renderer, one of the things that happens is what's called aliasing. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on my view some more so I can get close to some of these reflections. And I'm going to go ahead and just render this in the picture viewer so we can see what's going on. And of course, this is like actually a really good render. So some of the things you can see that are happening here in this image, I hope you can see them on YouTube. Who knows? I'm going to zoom in so you can see it a little bit better, right? But so in this spot, right, these highlights, this reflection is beautiful, right? This is clean. There's this nice edge. But you'll see that there's all of this noise and some pixelation in here, right? Where there's these bright pixels, and this reflection from another thing is sort of cloudy and fuzzy. With the way I have reflections set on this object, on this material, this should be really sharp. And so one of the things that aliasing does, and there's a couple other settings here, is it makes those things sharp. And occasionally, especially in transparent materials, you can get lots of aliasing when things go through the different settings. So to fix that or to change that, right, geometry is essentially the lowest. If I go to none and I render this again, we should have some really rough edges. I don't know if it's, oh yeah, you can see some serious aliasing now. Good. Okay, so let's look at the edge of some of these objects. So I'm going to zoom in again. Right, and right, so you can see, right, these jagged edges on all of these objects. That's that is aliasing, right? And anti-aliasing basically is an algorithm that finds these edges and smooths them out, right? It essentially feathers or softens the edges so we don't have as much aliasing. And so if I say, so geometry is okay. If I go to best, this takes a lot longer to render, but if I go ahead and render this, you'll see that, right, it's taking longer to do this. If you have a desktop computer with lots of cores, you're going to have some, right, your renders are going to look really, really great. Actually, sorry, that's not true. Your renders could all look really, really great. They will just take a lot less time to do, right? Essentially, each one of these little boxes that's on the screen that's filling in is one of my cores or one of my threads that this laptop has, right? If I had a much fancier laptop or a desktop with a huge processor in it that had a ton of cores, this thing would be just done, right? But that's not the case right now. So see, it's still rendering. It's taking a little bit longer. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom in again. Now I just want you to see how clean, right? I'm zoomed way in, but how clean these edges are. Right, all of these edges are cleaner. There's still some noise in the reflections, and maybe I do actually have this set with a little roughness in the reflectance. But so much more that's going on here is clean, and the image just looks a lot sharper and a lot better, right? A lot glossier. These edges and shadows look really, really nice on there, and much much better than they did previously. Right now, the other thing with min and max, or sorry, with anti-aliasing, is I can set the minimum level and the maximum level, and that if I go up to like 16 by 16 or something like that, again, it's going to continue to make it take longer and longer to do. But this is one way that you can start to improve the quality of your render. Other options, we're not going to really get into this right now, but there's just a bunch of things you can turn on and turn off. For the stereoscopic, right, it's going to essentially create two images offset a little bit, so you could do, so, you know, if you put them over, you get that fake 3D pop look. Team render, unfortunately, we cannot team render anything, but that basically means if you have a bunch of computers in a network and they all have a copy of Cinema4d on them, or a client copy of the render farm software they have, you can render this thing out to multiple machines and speed your process up a lot. And then we're not going to worry about material override right now either. Right? If you want to, you can also experiment with the physical renderer. There's some other specific settings here. We're going to talk about this later in the semester, but it allows you to do depth of field and motion blur, and it runs totally different. And so, but we're gonna go into that a little bit later. Okay, so now you have the basics of how to set some settings and how to do a render. So I've set this up. I know my output is going to be the right size. So I'm going to close my settings. I'm going to go back and I'm going to render the picture viewer. Now, one of the nice things about rendering the picture viewer is you can be like, oh, I want to see what that looks like, but I have these other things I need to do. While this is rendering, I can still work in this image. If I render to the viewport, if I go to zoom at all, if I do anything, even choosing a new tool, sometimes that will make that rendered image stop rendering and disappear. And so this, you know, allows you to do whatever. If you get to a point where you're like, oh crap, I didn't want to render this, then you can, there's this stop button here that you just say stop rendering and it will stop it. So if I click here, it says it's right, calculating an image. Do you want to stop it? And you just say yes. Right, and so this image is here, and you can actually save whatever is left, but you'll notice that there's holes where it didn't complete rendering, and you know the sides of the image are blank as well. But right, this is, you know, at 200% size. So if I go back down to 100%, you can kind of get some sense of, you know, how high quality this image is. So that's something else to remember with setting your quality settings is, what's the scale that people are going to view this at? And is, you know, how refined does this need to be in order to look good, right? Do I need really high quality because it's going to be blown up to be the side, you know, it'll be on the surface of a building? Or is this going to be viewed on somebody's, it has an Instagram post that you can't zoom because Instagram is annoying. And so it doesn't even matter, right? You can set your aliasing pretty low, and settings pretty low, and it'll be fine. Nobody will know the difference because they're staring at it on in some small image on their screen. Okay, so one last thing. Under this, you'll see this black arrow in the corner here. If I click and hold, there's several other options. We're not going to worry about this render all takes or make preview. The make preview is if you're doing animation, you can make a really crappy preview video of the animation, which is sometimes really useful, just to map motion and make sure timing and things like that are correct. There's this option to add to the render queue. We'll talk about that a little bit later. It basically, instead of rendering in the picture viewer, it renders it, but it does it in the background. There's also, but the one I want to say that's most interesting to me is this render region and interactive render region. If I go to render region, I get a crosshair, and I can just click and drag in my window, and I can say, okay, well, I just want to render this part, right? I don't want to wait for the whole image to render. I'm just working on this one particular thing, and I want to make sure the material looks right, or the lighting looks right when it hits this material. And so then you save yourself a ton of time because you're only rendering a tiny little bit of the image. The other thing is the interactive render region. And depending on your computer, this can be a really nice way to work with materials. So, right, I have these reflective materials are the primary ones in here. If I double click on this, what interactive does is it updates as quickly as it can, right? It doesn't update in real time, but it's pretty quick. So if I want to say, oh, let's see what this looks like if it's yellow, and there we go, right? And so then, it's not as high quality as, a full rendered image, but it gives you some idea. And there's actually this tiny, tiny little arrow here, which controls the quality of the render, right? If I crank it up higher, it's going to be a higher quality interactive render. You might be able to hear the fan going up in speed in the background. This does take some processing power to do. If I turn this down, when it renders, you'll see it's significantly more pixelated, but it goes much faster. And so sometimes this is really great if your computer can handle it while you're rendering. Like if I go to reflectance and you're like, oh, I wonder what roughness does, right? My roughness is set to 10%. If I drop this down to say 2%, and I might want this to be higher quality, now you can very clearly make out the reflected objects on the surface. So if I was to, bump the quality of this up some, then it's going to take a lot longer to render, but it's going pretty fast. You can see that I'm actually seeing these objects clearly reflected. They're not just like a spray of points and noise at this point, right? Or I can say, oh, what happens if I make it a lot rougher? Right? And so when I do that, it's still shiny and reflective, but it looks like it's brushed or, it's metal that's been, hit with some sort of texture. And so you can, you can experiment with this. And what's nice about it is that it makes it a little bit easier, a little bit faster to work with materials rather than trying to render out the whole thing. And, it's also adjustable, right? So I can say, oh, I really only, this is a pretty good band to test all of these colors. It's in all the different lighting that I have. And it's a small little window, so it doesn't take that long to render. So then if I want to, go in and change the color to, I don't know, let's say like a really bright green, I can do that, right? And it goes pretty quick. So this is all about rendering. Also, I can't remember, it's I or Command I to turn interactive render on and off. I can't remember what the quick key is, but if you hover over the option and then you look at the very bottom of your screen, there's a thin, I can't drag my mouse down there or I would, but under the materials, there's this very thin line and it says interactive render region, shortcut Alt-R, right? Which Alt and Option are the same key. Alt is what it's called in Windows, Option is what it's called on the Mac. But so if I say Option R, it'll do this interactive render region, and if I hit Option R again, it'll turn it off, right? So that's a quick key for turning that on and off, rather than going up to the menu again. Okay, so that's that's basically all I've got, but I have rendered to the picture viewer. If you just want to open the picture viewer without rendering to it, right, without creating another render, all you do is you go up to render in the menu at the very top of the screen, and you go down to, where is it? Oh, I thought that there was a one where you could just open it up. Maybe not. Yeah, okay, so you do have to render it to the render picture viewer. And rendering this whole image is going to take a little bit of time because of my settings, but I'll speed this part of the video up. Okay, so the image finally finished rendering, right? For some reason it took 3 minutes and 12 seconds to do that. It may be because I'm doing other things in the background. But something to note is that it does take time to render, and the more lights you have, if you turn, there's certain settings, if you turn them on, it just sort of amplifies the amount of time that it takes to do this. So when you are working with 3D, 3D software and things, make sure you give yourself enough time to render the projects before the project is due. It's something that very commonly happens, that renders can take a really long time to complete. Yeah. Okay. And so once it's rendered out, right, we just want to make sure we save it, and we click there, and right now, right, it's all of this should be set. I hit OK, and I just say, tutorial cameras and lights, final render, and save it. Now, what I should probably do for those of you in my class is also do another tutorial about converting a TIFF to a JPEG or a PNG, because okay, so I've saved the file, and that is the end of the tutorial. This is everything you should know to be able to finish Project 1 for the course. And if you are random folks on the internet using Cinema4d for the first time, hopefully it was useful. All right, have a good evening.